I never believed in those old Appalachian legends until the night I house-sat my grandmother's cabin deep in the Smoky Mountains. What happened that October evening still makes my hands shake when I think about it. My grandmother had moved to a nursing home in Knoxville, and someone needed to check on her property every few weeks. The cabin sat about 40 minutes from the nearest town, surrounded by dense woods that seemed to swallow all light after sunset. I figured it would be easy money, spend one night, make sure everything was secure, and leave in the morning. I arrived just as the sun started dipping behind the ridgeline. The cabin looked exactly as I remembered from childhood visits. Weathered wood siding, a sagging porch, and that old rocking chair that creaked even when no one sat in it. The isolation hit me immediately. No cell service, no neighbors for miles, just me and thousands of acres of forest. Inside smelled like dust and old memories. I turned on the lights, relieved when they actually worked. The place had that stillness that houses get when nobody's lived in them for months, like the air itself was holding its breath. I made a quick sweep of the rooms. Everything seemed fine. Kitchen, living room, 2 bedrooms, bathroom, all empty, all quiet, too quiet. I tried calling my mom from the landline to let her know I'd arrived safely, but the phone just gave me dead air. Great. I was completely cut off. But I'd brought supplies, downloaded some movies on my laptop, and figured I could tough it out for 12 hours. Around 8 p.m., I heated up some soup and settled onto the couch. That's when I heard it for the first time, a soft scratching sound coming from the wall behind me. I froze, spoon halfway to my mouth. The scratching continued for maybe 10 seconds, then stopped. Probably just mice or squirrels in the walls, I told myself. Old houses always have rodents. Nothing to worry about. But my heart was already beating faster. I tried focusing on my movie, but I couldn't shake this feeling of being watched. You know that prickly sensation on the back of your neck? It got so intense I had to turn around and check the windows behind me. Nothing but darkness pressing against the glass. My own reflection stared back, pale and nervous. The scratching started again around 9:30. This time it was louder, more deliberate. It moved along the wall from left to right, like something was dragging its nails across the wood inside the walls. I stood up, following the sound with my eyes. It traveled from the living room into the hallway, then stopped at my grandmother's bedroom door. My mouth went dry. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and approached the bedroom slowly. The door was slightly ajar, just as I'd left it. I pushed it open, shining my light inside. The old 4-poster bed, the dresser with family photos, the closet with its door firmly shut. Everything normal. But the temperature in that room was wrong. It had to be at least 15 degrees colder than the rest of the house. I could see my breath misting in the flashlight beam. That's when I noticed the closet door wasn't fully closed anymore. I distinctly remembered checking it earlier. It had been latched tight. Now it stood open maybe 2 inches, with absolute blackness beyond. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to get in my car and drive away. But some stubborn part of me refused to be scared out of my grandmother's house by creaky wood and a draft. I walked over and yanked the closet door open. Empty. Just old dresses and the smell of mothballs. I laughed at myself, shaky and too loud. I was being ridiculous. I closed the closet firmly, tested the latch to make sure it caught, and went back to the living room. That's when things got worse. At 10 p.m., I heard footsteps on the porch. Not the random creaks of wood settling, actual footsteps, slow and deliberate. They started at one end of the porch and walked to the other, back and forth, back and forth. I stood in the middle of the living room, barely breathing, as something paced outside the front door. I crept to the window and peeked through the curtains. The porch was empty, but those footsteps kept moving across the old boards, making them groan with weight that wasn't there. My hands trembled as I checked that the front door was locked, deadbolt and chain both secure. I went around to every window, every door, making sure everything was locked tight. The back door, the side windows, everything. The footsteps stopped suddenly. Total silence. I waited, straining to hear. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my throat. 1 minute passed. 2. Nothing. Then I heard my grandmother's voice. It came from her bedroom, clear as day. "Tommy, is that you, honey?" My blood turned to ice. My name is Thomas, but my grandmother always called me Tommy. The voice was perfect, that slight rasp she'd developed in her 80s, the East Tennessee accent, everything. "Tommy, I need your help in here." I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My grandmother was in a nursing home 40 miles away. She wasn't here. She couldn't be here. "Tommy, please, I'm cold." The voice sounded closer now, like it was coming from the hallway. I forced myself to look. The hallway was empty, but her bedroom door was wide open again. I'd closed it. I know I'd closed it. Something was in this house with me, and it was using my grandmother's voice. I grabbed my car keys and phone, ready to run. That's when every light in the cabin went out at once. Complete darkness. The kind of darkness you only get miles from any town where no light pollution reaches. I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face, my flashlight. I'd left it in the bedroom. I stood frozen in the living room, trying to remember the layout of the furniture. That's when I heard breathing, not my own, something else, something that wheezed and rattled with each breath. And it was coming from right behind me. I bolted for the front door, crashing into the coffee table, knocking over something that shattered. My hands found the doorknob, fumbled with the deadbolt, yanked the chain free. I burst out onto the porch and ran for my car. The motion sensor light should have turned on. It didn't. I slammed my hand around my pocket for the keys. They weren't there. I'd dropped them inside. No. The breathing was on the porch now, right behind me. Close enough that I could feel cold air on my neck. I ran, just ran blindly into the woods, branches whipping my face, roots trying to trip me. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours. My lungs burned, my legs screamed. But I kept going, because that breathing stayed right behind me, never getting closer, but never falling away. Eventually, I broke out onto the main road and flagged down a pickup truck. The driver, an old mountain man with a long beard, took one look at my face and told me to get in. He didn't ask questions until we were miles down the mountain. When I finally got cell service and called the police, they agreed to meet me at the cabin at first light. I refused to go back alone. 3 officers accompanied me at dawn. The cabin looked peaceful in the morning sun, harmless. The front door stood wide open, just as I'd left it when I ran. We went inside together. Everything was normal. Lights worked fine, no signs of a break-in. My car keys sat on the coffee table where I'd apparently placed them before going to my car. But that wasn't right. I'd grabbed them. I know I'd grabbed them. The officers found nothing unusual. One of them suggested carbon monoxide poisoning or a bad reaction to altitude. They were polite, but clearly thought I'd panicked over nothing. But here's what I didn't tell them. What I couldn't tell them, because they'd never believe me. In my grandmother's bedroom, that closet door was open again, and written in the dust on her dresser, in handwriting I recognized from 100 birthday cards, were 2 words: "Come back." I sold the cabin within a month, never went inside it again. My grandmother died 3 weeks ago, and at the funeral, her nurse pulled me aside. She said that in her final days, my grandmother kept talking about her cabin, kept saying she needed to go home, that something was waiting for her there. Then the nurse told me something that made my blood run cold. She said my grandmother kept asking about me specifically, kept asking when Tommy was coming back to visit her at the cabin. But here's the thing. I never told my grandmother about that night, never told anyone who would have talked to her about it. So how did she know I'd been there? And what's still waiting in that cabin, using the voices of the people we love to lure us back into the dark? I never believed in the old Appalachian warnings until that night in October 2019. I was 23, freshly graduated, and stupid enough to think I could handle anything. My grandmother's cabin in the hills of eastern Kentucky had been sitting empty for 6 months since she passed, and I volunteered to stay there for a week to sort through her things. Everyone in my family had excuses. Looking back, I think they knew something I didn't. The cabin sat 3 miles up a winding dirt road, surrounded by dense forest that seemed to swallow sound. No neighbors for miles, no cell service, just me, the woods, and whatever lived in them. I arrived just before sunset on a Tuesday. The autumn air was crisp, carrying that earthy smell of decaying leaves. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered from childhood visits, a 2-bedroom structure with a wraparound porch and windows that reflected the dying light like dead eyes. I hauled my bags inside, noting how every floorboard groaned under my weight, announcing my presence to the emptiness. That first night was uneventful. I unpacked, made some instant ramen on the old gas stove, and started sorting through boxes in the living room. My grandmother had been a collector, not quite a hoarder, but close. Stacks of newspapers from the 1970s, mason jars filled with buttons and coins, photographs of people I'd never met staring with that unsettling intensity old photos always have. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night. That's when I first heard it. A knock. 3 deliberate raps on the front door. I froze, my hand halfway to the light switch. Nobody knew I was here except my parents, and they were 8 hours away. The nearest town was 40 minutes down the mountain. I waited, holding my breath, telling myself it was a branch or some animal. Then it came again. 3 knocks. Precise. Intentional. Human. My heart hammered against my ribs as I crept to the door, avoiding the squeaky floorboards I'd already memorized. The cabin had no peephole, just a door with a small window at the top, covered by a yellowed curtain. I pulled the curtain aside just enough to peek out. Nothing. Just the porch bathed in moonlight and the wall of black trees beyond. I stood there for 5 minutes, watching, waiting. The mountain silence pressed against my ears. Finally, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe a branch really had fallen, hit the door at a weird angle. I locked the deadbolt that was already locked and went to bed. Sleep didn't come easy. I lay in my grandmother's old bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the cabin settle. Old houses make noise. I knew that. But these sounds felt different, purposeful. Like something was learning the geography of the space, testing the limits of the walls. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps on the porch, not the scurrying of a raccoon or the soft padding of a deer. These were heavy, measured steps, the kind that come from boots. They moved from one end of the porch to the other, slow and deliberate, stopping at each window. I could hear the old boards creaking under weight, tracking the movement as it circled the cabin. I grabbed my phone, still no service, and the hunting knife I'd found in one of my grandmother's drawers. The footsteps stopped at my bedroom window. I could hear breathing on the other side of the glass, slow and raspy, fogging up the pane. The curtain was drawn, but I swear I saw a shadow, tall and impossibly thin, blocking out the moonlight. Then it spoke. "Let me in." The voice was wrong, too deep, too hollow, like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "It's cold out here." I didn't move, didn't breathe. Every survival instinct screamed at me to stay silent, to play dead. "I know you're in there," it continued, almost sing-song now. "I can hear your heart beating. Thump, 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 like a rabbit." The shadow moved away from the window. I heard those footsteps again, this time heading toward the back of the cabin, toward the door I'd forgotten to check. I bolted out of bed and ran through the dark house, knife clutched in my shaking hand. The back door was old, the lock barely functional. As I rounded the corner into the kitchen, I saw the doorknob turning. I slammed my body against the door and twisted the deadbolt just as something pushed from the other side. The door shuddered. Whatever was out there was strong, way stronger than any person should be. I braced myself against it, feeling the wood bow inward with each impact. "Why won't you let me in?" the voice whined, now taking on a childlike quality that was somehow worse than the deep rumble. "I'm so cold. I just want to get warm." The pushing stopped. Silence fell so suddenly it felt like a physical thing. I stayed pressed against the door, every muscle locked, sweat running down my face despite the cold. Minutes passed, 5, 10, nothing. Then I heard it on the roof. Something was crawling across the shingles, nails or claws scraping against wood. It moved to the chimney. I heard scratching, then a shower of soot falling down into the fireplace. My grandmother never capped that chimney. I ran to the living room and grabbed the fireplace poker, standing ready as more soot cascaded down. The scratching grew louder, closer. I could see the darkness of the flue, imagining those long fingers reaching down, feeling for purchase. That's when I remembered my grandmother's words from when I was a child. She'd pulled me aside during a visit, her papery hand gripping mine tight enough to hurt. "If you're ever in that cabin alone at night and something asks to come in, you don't answer. You don't acknowledge it. You pretend you're not there, even if it knows you are. Because the moment you answer, you invite it in. And there are things in these mountains that don't need a door to enter once you've invited them." I'd thought she was senile. Now I realized I'd already broken the rule. I'd responded, not with words, but with action. I'd acknowledged its presence by barricading the door. The scratching stopped. The cabin fell silent again, but this time it felt expectant, like something was waiting for me to make the next move. I stood in the dark living room, poker in one hand, knife in the other, understanding that I'd made a terrible mistake. A whisper came from right behind me. "Thank you for answering." I spun around, swinging the poker, but hit only air. The voice giggled, a wet, rattling sound that came from everywhere and nowhere. The windows began to fog up from the inside, and in the condensation, words appeared. "Invited, invited, invited," written over and over in every window I could see. The temperature plummeted. My breath came out in thick clouds. The lights flickered once, twice, then died completely, plunging the cabin into absolute darkness. In that blackness, I heard movement. Not footsteps anymore, but a sliding sound, like something dragging itself across the floor. I backed against the wall, trying to orient myself, when my hand touched something cold and wet. I jerked away and fumbled for my phone, using its dying battery to provide a weak blue light. The wall behind me was covered in handprints, dozens of them in various sizes, pressed into the wood as if the wall had been soft mud. They were still wet, glistening in the phone light. As I watched, a new one appeared right next to my head, forming from nothing, fingers spreading slowly like a flower blooming. I ran. Didn't matter where, just away. I crashed through the cabin in the dark, bouncing off furniture, knocking over boxes. I made it to the front door and yanked it open. The night outside was wrong. The stars were gone. The trees were gone. There was just black, a void so complete it seemed to absorb my phone's light. And in that void, I could see things moving. Shapes that were almost human but not quite, with too many joints and limbs that bent the wrong way. The thing behind me whispered again, closer now. "Where are you going? You can't leave. You invited me. I'm home now." I slammed the door and locked it, knowing it was useless. If what my grandmother said was true, locks couldn't keep it out anymore. I'd acknowledged it. I'd answered it. I'd let it in without realizing what I was doing. The sun rose 6 hours later, the longest 6 hours of my life. I spent them huddled in the corner of the living room, weapons clutched in numb hands, listening to that thing move through the cabin. It never showed itself, but I heard it, in the walls, under the floor, above the ceiling. Sometimes it hummed old folk songs my grandmother used to sing. Sometimes it cried in voices I recognized. My mother, my father, my grandmother. When daylight finally filtered through the windows, everything stopped. The temperature normalized. The handprints faded from the walls. The words vanished from the windows. By morning, you could almost believe it had been a nightmare. But I knew better. I packed my things and left before noon, leaving most of my grandmother's possessions untouched. As I drove down that dirt road, I looked in my rearview mirror. The cabin looked normal, peaceful even, sunlight glinting off the windows. But in one of those windows, on the second floor in the room I'd stayed in, I saw a figure, tall and thin, watching me leave. That was 3 months ago. I'm back in the city now, living in a 4th-floor apartment with 3 roommates and locks on every door. I should feel safe, but sometimes late at night, I hear 3 knocks on my bedroom door. And when I check the doorknob in the morning, there are handprints in the condensation. Small ones at first, growing bigger each time. My grandmother tried to warn me. The old Appalachian families know there are rules about these mountains, about the things that live in the spaces between trees where the light doesn't quite reach. Rules that seem superstitious until you break them. I answered the door that night. I acknowledged what was outside, and now I think it followed me home. Last week, my roommate asked me why I always keep my door locked from the inside, why I never answer when someone knocks. I didn't know how to explain that I'm not trying to keep people out anymore. I'm trying to keep something in. Because lately, I've been having dreams where I'm back in those mountains, back in that cabin. And in those dreams, I'm not alone in my body anymore. There's something else inside, looking out through my eyes, learning to move my limbs, practicing my voice. This morning, I woke up to find my apartment door wide open. I don't remember opening it. My roommate said they heard me leave around 3 a.m., that I was humming an old folk song as I walked down the stairs. They said I moved weird, like my joints were loose, like I was learning how to walk. I don't remember any of it. And that's what scares me most. Not what happened in that cabin, but what I invited in. Because it's not outside anymore, knocking and asking for permission. It's in here with me, and I think it's almost done learning how to be me. I never thought silence could be so loud. But that night, alone in my grandparents' cabin deep in the Appalachian woods, I learned that silence has a weight to it, a presence, and sometimes that presence isn't empty at all. My name's Connor, and what happened to me 3 years ago still makes my hands shake when I think about it. I was 22 then, fresh out of college, and my grandparents had just moved to a nursing home in Asheville. They'd asked me to spend a week at their old cabin, sorting through decades of belongings before they sold the property. The cabin sat about 40 minutes outside the nearest town, surrounded by dense forest that seemed to swallow the world whole. I arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. The trees were at their peak, brilliant oranges and deep reds that would have been beautiful if they hadn't made everything feel so isolated. The cabin itself was exactly as I remembered from childhood visits. Weathered wood, a sagging porch, windows that rattled in their frames. But it felt different without my grandparents there, emptier, like the building itself knew it had been abandoned. The first 2 nights passed without incident. I spent my days packing boxes and my evenings sitting by the fireplace, trying to ignore how the darkness outside pressed against the windows like something alive. But on the 3rd night, everything changed. I'd been sorting through the attic when my phone buzzed, my mom calling to check in. We talked for maybe 10 minutes before the call dropped. Cell service out here was always spotty. I tried calling back, but I had no signal, not unusual. I pocketed my phone and headed downstairs as the sun began to set. That's when I first noticed it. A smell. Faint but unmistakable. Like wet earth and rotting leaves, but with something else underneath. Something sweet and wrong. I checked the kitchen, thinking maybe something had spoiled in the fridge. Nothing. The smell seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I convinced myself I was imagining it and made dinner. instant ramen, because I'm not exactly a chef. As I ate at the small kitchen table, darkness fell completely, the kind of darkness you only get in the mountains, where there are no streetlights, no neighbors, no ambient glow from civilization, just an absolute suffocating blackness beyond the windows. Around 9 o'clock, I heard the first knock, 3 sharp raps on the front door, loud, deliberate. I froze with my hand halfway to my coffee mug. My heart started hammering. Who would be out here? The nearest neighbor was miles away. I waited, listening. Nothing. Maybe a branch had fallen against the door. Maybe the wind had knocked something over on the porch. I stood up and walked slowly to the door, my footsteps creaking on the old floorboards. I flicked on the porch light and peered through the small window beside the door. Nothing. Just the empty porch and the wall of darkness beyond. I unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door a crack. The smell hit me immediately. Stronger now, that rotting earth scent mixed with something that made my stomach turn. But the porch was empty. I looked down and my breath caught in my throat. There were muddy footprints, bare footprints, leading up the porch steps, stopping right in front of the door, then leading back down and disappearing into the darkness. But here's what made my skin crawl. The footprints were wrong. Too long, too narrow. And the toes were splayed out at unnatural angles, like whoever left them had joints that bent in ways human joints shouldn't. I slammed the door and locked it, my hands trembling. I told myself it was just some hiker, someone who'd gotten lost and needed help. But they would have called out, wouldn't they? They would have said something. I grabbed my phone, still no signal. Of course not. I tried to calm down. Paced the living room, checked all the windows to make sure they were locked. They were. Everything was secure. I was being paranoid. This was just the isolation getting to me, making me see things that weren't there. Then I heard it. A scratching sound, coming from the back of the cabin. Long, slow scrapes against wood, like fingernails or claws. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and moved toward the sound, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The scratching was coming from the back door, the one that led out to the small deck overlooking the forest. I crept closer, the flashlight beam shaking in my hand. The scratching stopped. Complete silence. Then, slowly, the doorknob began to turn. I watched in frozen horror as it rotated clockwise, testing the lock. The door was old, the lock even older. The knob turned all the way, and the door rattled against the deadbolt. Something was trying to get in. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking. "Who's there?" The rattling stopped. Silence again. Then I heard it, a sound that still haunts my nightmares. Breathing. Slow, raspy breathing right on the other side of the door, not like a person catching their breath after a hike. This was deliberate, measured, like whatever was out there was savoring this moment. I backed away from the door, my mind screaming at me to run, to get out, to drive away from this place. But my car keys were upstairs, and I'd have to cross in front of windows to get to them. The breathing moved. I could hear it traveling along the back of the cabin, passing the windows. I ducked below the window line and crawled into the hallway, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I needed to get to my room, get my keys, and get the hell out. I made it to the stairs and climbed them as quietly as I could, wincing at every creak. When I reached the top, I glanced back down at the living room. A face was pressed against the back window. I only saw it for a second. Pale skin, too pale, stretched tight over prominent bones. And the eyes. God, the eyes were wrong. Too large, too dark. They reflected my flashlight beam like an animal's eyes, glowing with a yellow-green tint. I ran, burst into my room and slammed the door, locking it behind me. I grabbed my keys from the nightstand with shaking hands and looked at the window. The curtains were drawn, but I could see movement outside, a shadow passing back and forth, and that smell was stronger now, seeping in through the gaps around the window frame. Then, The scratching started on my bedroom window. Those same long, slow scrapes. Testing, searching. I backed into the corner of the room, clutching my keys so hard they bit into my palm. The scratching grew more insistent, more aggressive. The window rattled in its frame. My phone buzzed. I nearly dropped it. 1 bar of signal, a miracle. I pulled up my recent calls and hit my mom's number, praying it would connect. It rang once, twice, then it connected, but all I could hear was static. "Mom," I shouted into the phone. "Mom, if you can hear me, call the police. Send them to the cabin. There's something outside." The static continued. I don't know if she heard me. The call dropped. My signal was gone again. The scratching at the window stopped. For a moment I felt a surge of hope. Maybe it had given up. Maybe it had left. Then I heard footsteps above me, on the roof. Slow, heavy footsteps moving toward the chimney. My blood went cold. The fireplace. I'd used it tonight. The flue was open. I burst out of my room and ran down the stairs, my feet barely touching the steps. I could hear something scraping against the metal inside the chimney, scrambling, descending. I ran to the fireplace and saw the damper chain swinging. I grabbed it and yanked, trying to close the flue, but it was stuck. Years of rust and creosote had locked it in place. Something landed in the fireplace with a heavy thud. Ash billowed out into the room. I stumbled backward, my flashlight beam fixed on the dark opening. For a moment, nothing moved. Then a hand emerged from the shadows. A long, pale hand with fingers that seemed too long, too thin, the nails thick and yellowed. I ran for the front door, fumbling with the deadbolt. Behind me, I heard that breathing again, closer now. In the house, with me. The deadbolt finally gave way, and I yanked the door open, sprinting into the darkness. I ran blindly through the woods, branches whipping at my face, roots trying to trip me. I could hear it behind me, not running but moving steadily, those wet, slapping footsteps on the forest floor. I didn't dare look back. I just ran toward where I thought the driveway was, my lungs burning, my legs screaming. I found my car more by luck than memory. I threw myself inside and locked the doors, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I threw it in reverse, my headlights sweeping across the trees. That's when I saw it. Standing at the edge of the woods, just beyond the driveway. It was tall, impossibly tall and thin, its limbs hanging at its sides at wrong angles. Its skin looked wet in the headlights, glistening like something that had just crawled out of the earth. And its face... I only saw it for a second before I looked away. But that second was enough. It wasn't human. It had never been human. I drove away so fast I nearly crashed 3 times on that winding mountain road. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station on the outskirts of town, where I sat in my car under the fluorescent lights, shaking and crying until the sun came up. The police went to the cabin the next day. They found the muddy footprints. They found scratch marks on the windows and the back door. They found soot and ash scattered across the living room floor. But they didn't find whatever had been there. They said it was probably just a bear, that I'd gotten spooked by wildlife and let my imagination run wild. But I know what I saw. I know what was in that cabin. My grandparents sold the property a month later. The new owners gutted and renovated the whole thing. I heard they only lasted 6 months before they sold it again. The place has changed hands 4 times in 3 years. Nobody stays long. And when I looked up the property's history, I found something that made my blood run cold. In 1987, a woman named Sarah Pike went missing from that area. She'd been hiking alone in those woods and never came back. They searched for weeks but never found a body. The last entry in her journal, recovered from her abandoned campsite, read, "Something is watching me. It's been following me for days. I can smell it even when I can't see it. Tomorrow I'm going to confront it. I need to know what it wants." They never found Sarah Pike. But I think I know where she ended up. I think I know what she became. Because that thing I saw in the cabin, The way it moved, the way it tested every entry point like it was remembering how to be human. That wasn't some forest creature. That was something that had been human once. Something that had been taken by those woods and twisted into something else. Something that remembered what it was like to want shelter, to seek warmth, to knock on doors, but had forgotten why. I still get calls sometimes, late at night. When I answer, there's just breathing, slow, deliberate, and underneath it, so faint I might be imagining it, I hear the sound of wind through Appalachian trees. I never went back to those mountains, and I never will, because some places aren't meant for people. Some places have their own rules, their own residents, and when you're alone in the deep woods, when the darkness is complete and the silence is heavy, you're not really alone at all. You're being watched, you're being tested, and if you're unlucky enough, you're being chosen. I just hope that whatever I saw that night stays in those mountains. I hope it never decides to follow me home. Because sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone in my apartment, I catch that smell again. Wet earth and rotting leaves. And I wonder if closing the door that night was enough, or if I let something follow me out.